On a Tuesday morning in August 1944, a German infantry corporal named Heinrich Brandt stood in a peach orchard in Chilton County, Alabama, doing something that 3 months earlier would have seemed to him a scene from a fevered dream. He was picking fruit, carefully, methodically, filling wooden crates in the Alabama heat alongside other men from his former unit, most of them wearing faded American Army fatigues, with the letters PW stenciled on the back in black paint. An American guard sat on a fence post 30 yards away, reading a newspaper. Nobody was watching the prisoners very closely. There was, functionally, nowhere to go. At midday, a farm truck arrived carrying lunch. Brandt described what happened next in a letter to his wife that American intelligence officers read, cleared, and allowed to be sent. The letter is preserved today in the archives of the German Federal Military Archive in Freiburg, one of thousands of similar documents that tell, collectively, one of the strangest and most revealing stories of the entire Second World War. He wrote, "I am embarrassed to tell you this, but I must. Today for lunch we received roast pork, potatoes, green beans, bread with butter, and a piece of cake. I have not eaten this way since before the war. I thought of you and the children, and I felt something I do not have a word for. The guard offered me a second piece of cake, and I took it. I am a prisoner of the country I was fighting against 3 months ago, and I am eating better than you are. I do not know what to do with this fact except to tell you." Brandt's wife received the letter 6 weeks later in the town of Lübeck, where she was raising 3 children on rations that had been declining steadily since 1943. She kept the letter. She did not write back about the cake. The story of what happened when 425,000 German prisoners of war were brought to the United States between 1942 and 1945 is a story that fits no comfortable narrative about war, enemies, or the nature of national character. It is a story about what happens when the reality of a country collides with everything an enemy has been taught to believe about it, and about what that collision does to the men who experience it. The prisoners who came to America expecting to find a decadent, racially divided, spiritually hollow nation found instead something that none of their training, none of their ideology, and none of their government's propaganda had prepared them to process. A country so abundantly, almost carelessly wealthy, that it was feeding its enemies better than Germany was feeding its own soldiers. This is the story of how German prisoners of war in America became, without anyone planning it that way, some of the most important witnesses to the truth that defeated their nation. The system that brought German prisoners to American farms was not originally designed with any ideological purpose in mind. It was designed to solve a practical problem that the American war economy had created for itself. By 1943, the United States had mobilized approximately 12 million men into military service. These were men who had been, before the war, farmers, farmhands, fruit pickers, cannery workers, and agricultural laborers of every description, the workforce that fed the country and, increasingly, fed the Allies. With that workforce in uniform, American agriculture faced a labor crisis that threatened to undermine the food production the war effort required. Crops were going unharvested in California orchards. Sugar beet fields in Colorado had no one to work them. Cotton in the South, wheat in the Midwest, vegetables across the entire agricultural belt of the country needed hands that weren't available. The Geneva Convention of 1929, which the United States had ratified and which governed the treatment of prisoners of war, permitted prisoner labor under specific conditions. Prisoners could not be used for work directly related to military operations. They could not be placed in dangerous conditions. They had to be paid a rate comparable to American soldiers performing equivalent work, 80 cents per day in scrip redeemable at the camp canteen. Within these constraints, they could be put to work, and the American agricultural sector needed them urgently enough that the War Department moved relatively quickly to make the arrangement function. The scale of what followed was remarkable. By the summer of 1944, German prisoners were working on farms in 46 of the 48 states. They were picking apples in Virginia and Washington, harvesting sugar cane in Louisiana, canning tomatoes in Maryland, cutting timber in Maine, picking cotton in Texas, processing beets in Wyoming, and performing dozens of other agricultural and light industrial tasks that the labor shortage had made critical. Farmers who needed workers applied to their Regional War Manpower Commission office, which coordinated with the Army to provide prisoner labor details. The government charged farmers the prevailing local wage for the work, approximately $1.50 per day in most regions, and retained the difference after paying the prisoners their 80 cents, using the surplus to offset the costs of the prisoner of war program. The arrangement worked, in purely economic terms, extraordinarily well. American agriculture avoided the crisis that unrestricted labor shortages would have caused. German prisoners received work, income, and a degree of purposeful activity that camp life alone could not provide. American farmers got labor they needed at costs they could manage. And German prisoners got something that nobody had planned for them to receive, sustained. Close contact with the daily reality of American life, in a way that no amount of official information, propaganda, or managed exposure could have replicated. The first shock was the food. It was almost always the food. The American military operated its prisoner of war camps under a feeding standard that was tied, as the Geneva Convention required, to the standard maintained for American troops. This meant that German prisoners received meals calculated at approximately 3,200 Kaloreb, the Standardje, Army daily ration for active duty soldiers. The meals were served in mess halls that functioned on the same cafeteria model as American military dining facilities. Men moved through a line with trays, received standard portions, and could frequently request seconds if the meal allowed for it. For German prisoners arriving in American camps in 1943 and 1944, this standard was not simply adequate. It was, by the measure of what they had experienced in the German military during the war's increasingly difficult logistical conditions, extraordinary. By 1943, the German Army's field ration had been reduced from its 1939 standard in multiple categories. Meat portions were smaller. Fat allocations had been cut. The variety of the diet had narrowed as supply chains under Allied bombing became less reliable. Soldiers fighting on the Eastern Front described conditions that ranged from reduced rations to genuine hunger depending on the season. And the tactical situation. The contrast between what German soldiers were eating in the field and what German prisoners were eating in Alabama was not subtle. Private Werner Schäfer, captured in Tunisia in May 1943 and processed through Fort Meade before being transferred to a camp in Concordia, Kansas, described his first American meal in a memoir he wrote decades after the war. "I had been eating German Army field rations for 11 months," he wrote. "The last weeks in Tunisia, the rations had been cut because the supply ships were being sunk before they reached us. When I sat down in the American mess hall for the first time and received a plate with meat, vegetables, potatoes, bread, butter, and a glass of milk, I did not eat immediately. I looked at the plate for what my neighbor told me was a long time. He asked if something was wrong. I told him nothing was wrong. I was trying to remember the last time I had seen butter." The psychological impact of this contrast was not uniform across the prisoner population. Some prisoners, particularly those with strong ideological commitments to National Socialism, experienced it as a kind of corruption, an attempt to use material comfort to weaken their political resolve. They maintained, sometimes aggressively, that the abundance they were experiencing was irrelevant to the outcome of the war. That German spirit would ultimately prevail over American materialism, and that accepting the comfort of captivity was a form of collaboration with the enemy. But these prisoners were a minority that grew smaller as the war progressed, and as the news from Germany became grimmer. For the majority, the food was not a political statement. It was a daily, inescapable, embodied confrontation with a fact about the country. They were imprisoned in that all the ideological preparation in the world had not equipped them to process. America was not running short of anything. The farm work took the prisoners out of the camps and into American communities in ways that produced a different kind of contact than any controlled environment could have generated. German prisoners working on American farms were, by necessity, in daily proximity to American civilians, the farmers who employed them, their families, the workers at local canneries and processing facilities, the residents of small towns through which prisoner labor trucks passed each morning and evening. The interactions this proximity produced were governed by regulations that prohibited fraternization beyond what work required. American civilians were not supposed to invite prisoners to their homes, give them gifts, or develop personal relationships with them. The regulations were enforced with varying degrees of rigor depending on the location, the nature of the work, and the personalities involved. In practice, the regulations were frequently observed more as general guidelines than as absolute rules, particularly in agricultural settings where the boundary between work interaction and human contact was difficult to police. Farmers, whose prisoners were careful, hardworking, and honest, qualities that many American employers noted with some surprise in their official reports to the War Manpower Commission, sometimes developed attitudes toward them that went beyond the strictly instrumental. Farm wives who brought lunch to the fields sometimes sat and talked with prisoners who spoke enough English to converse. Farm children who spent summers near prisoner work parties sometimes learned to communicate across the language barrier with the resourceful creativity of children everywhere. Walter fällt an Huhr min längste and later wrote about his experience in a German veterans journal, described a conversation with the farmer's wife that stayed with him for the rest of his life. She had asked him, through a combination of German she was learning and English he was acquiring, whether he had children. He had shown her a photograph of his daughter in Bremen. She had looked at it for a long time and then said something he didn't fully understand at the time, but worked out later with a dictionary. She had said, "She looks like she has kind eyes." Felton wrote that this observation, that a German soldier's daughter looked like she had kind eyes, offered by an American woman to a German prisoner in a Pennsylvania dairy barn, was the moment when the war stopped making sense to him in the way it had always made sense before. The encounters were not uniformly warm or productive. Some American communities received the presence of German prisoners with hostility, particularly in areas where families had lost sons in the fighting. Some prisoners remained aggressively hostile to any human contact that might compromise their ideological position. Some interactions produced misunderstandings or tensions that required intervention from camp authorities. The human reality of 425,000 men distributed across 46 states and hundreds of agricultural communities was too varied and complex to reduce to any single characterization. But the pattern that emerges from the aggregate record, from the prisoners' letters, from the farmers' reports, from the post-war testimonies collected by American historians and German researchers in the decades following the conflict, is one of incremental, irregular, and often unexpected humanization. German prisoners, who had been trained to understand Americans as racially degenerate, spiritually hollow, and culturally contemptible, found themselves working alongside people who were, in most of the ways that daily contact measures humanity, ordinary. They were tired at the end of the day and grateful for help with heavy work. They worried about their sons overseas and their crops in drought conditions. They were curious about the prisoners and willing, within limits, to see them as people rather than enemies. The letters that prisoners wrote home constitute the most direct record. of what the American experience did to their understanding of the war and of the country they were imprisoned in. American military censors read every letter before it was sent, a practice that produced an inadvertent archive of extraordinary historical value. The censors were looking for military intelligence, escape plans, coded messages, and content that violated the terms of the Geneva Convention. What they found, in letter after letter, was something they had not been specifically looking for: a running account of German prisoners coming to terms. In real time and in their own words, with the gap between what they had been told about America and what America actually was. The food appeared constantly, as it had in Brandt's letter. So did the physical landscape. Germany, in 1944, was being systematically bombed. German cities that prisoners had grown up in were being reduced to rubble that their families described in return letters. With the careful understatement of people who had learned that direct description of destruction could be dangerous. American cities, as prisoners saw them from the windows of the trains that transported them to inland camps, were undamaged, busy, and apparently indifferent to the war in ways that German cities could not be indifferent because the war was falling on them from the sky. Corporal Ernst Dietrich Tramptetur, Nebraska, in September 1943, wrote to his parents in Cologne, a city that had been heavily bombed since 1942, with a mixture of guilt and astonishment that his censors found sufficiently remarkable to preserve in a summary report. He wrote, "I passed through several American cities on the train. I looked for the bomb damage. I could not find any. The cities looked as they must have looked before the war. The shops appeared to be open. People were walking on the streets as if nothing unusual was happening anywhere in the world. I thought about what you described in your last letter about the raid on the Neumarkt neighborhood. I am in a country that does not know what a raid looks like. I am not sure what this means for the war, but I think it means something important." Dietrich's formulation, "I am not sure what this means for the war, but I think it means something important," captures the quality of understanding that the American prisoner experience characteristically produced. It was not the sudden, dramatic conversion of an ideological true believer. It was the slow, reluctant, evidence-driven recognition that the premises underlying a set of beliefs were not matching the reality those beliefs were supposed to describe. German propaganda had described America as a nation in crisis, racially divided, politically dysfunctional, economically overextended, spiritually incapable of the sustained sacrifice that war required. What the prisoners were seeing, from train windows and farm fields and mess hall lunch counters, was a nation that did not appear to be in crisis by any observable measure. The canteen was another recurring feature of the letters. Each prisoner camp maintained a store where prisoners could spend their 80-cent daily scrip on items that ranged from toiletries and cigarettes to candy, Coca-Cola, and ice cream. The availability of these goods that had been disappearing from German civilian life since 1942, as rationing tightened and production was redirected entirely toward the war effort, was, for many prisoners, more disorienting than any single explicit argument about American power could have been. Sergeant Major Otto Klesman, a decorated veteran of the North African campaign who arrived in America in the summer of 1943, still committed to the belief that Germany would prevail, described the canteen at his camp in Fort Devens, Massachusetts, in a letter to his brother that the censors flagged as psychologically significant and preserved in full. He wrote, "There is a store here where we can buy things with the money we earn working. Today I bought chocolate, 2 packs of cigarettes, and a bottle of something called Coca-Cola. The chocolate was real chocolate, not the substitute they have been giving us since 1942. I stood outside the store and ate the chocolate and thought about what it means that a country at war can give its prisoners real chocolate, while its enemies are giving their own soldiers substitute chocolate. I did not reach a conclusion. But I am thinking about it. The re-education program that American authorities eventually implemented in the prisoner of war camps has received considerable historical attention. Much of it focused on whether it succeeded in producing democratic attitudes among the prisoners who participated in it. The program, known as the Intellectual Diversion Program, distributed carefully selected German-language books and periodicals, organized lectures on democratic governance and American history, showed films, and provided educational opportunities that ranged from English language classes to university-level courses in some larger camps. The program's effects were genuine but secondary to a process of education that was happening. Without any official direction, the education of daily contact with American reality. What the Intellectual Diversion Program provided was a framework for processing conclusions that many prisoners were already reaching on their own. It gave them language and context for observations they were making from train windows and farm fields and mess hall queues. It did not create the observations. General Frederick Hatch, who oversaw the prisoner of war program for a significant portion of the war, acknowledged this, dynamic in his post-war assessment of what had actually changed prisoner attitudes most effectively. The formal program was useful, he said, but the most powerful education was the country itself. A prisoner who picked peaches in Georgia for 3 months, ate 3 meals a day in an American mess hall, earned money he could spend on chocolate at a canteen, and wrote letters home to a family living under bombing raids. That prisoner had received an education no curriculum could have designed better. He had seen, directly, what the country was capable of. He had experienced, personally, how it treated its enemies. And he had compared that experience to what he knew about how his own country was treating its own people. The returns home, when they came mostly in 1946 and 1947 as repatriation was gradually completed after the war's end, produced some of the strangest homecomings in the history of warfare. German prisoners returning from America arrived in a country that had been physically, economically, and psychologically destroyed to a degree that their letters home had not fully captured, and that their American experience had given them no framework to imagine. Cities they had grown up in were rubble. Families they had left behind were surviving on rations that made the German military field. Rations of 1943 looked generous. The country that had sent them to war with promises of inevitable victory had delivered. Instead, total defeat, total occupation, and the beginning of a reckoning with what that country had done that would take generations to complete. The men who returned from American farms and American camps carried with them experiences that set them apart from their contemporaries in ways that were sometimes difficult to articulate and sometimes deeply unwelcome. They had eaten well when their families had not. They had been treated with a decency that German military doctrine had taught them to expect only within a national community of shared identity, and they had received it from the enemy. They had seen a country at war that functioned, from their vantage point, as if the war were an inconvenience being managed rather than an existential crisis being survived. Heinrich Brandt was repatriated to Lübeck in March 1947 in an interview he gave to a German journalist in 1962. He described reuniting with his wife and children after 3 years of separation. His wife, he said, had prepared the best meal she could manage from what was available, which was not much. They sat at the table and he looked at the food and thought of Alabama and felt something he still did not have a word for. He did not tell her about this. He ate what she had prepared and said it was wonderful. In a sense, he told the journalist, it was, not because of what it was, because of who made it and what she had been through to be there to make it at all. The men who had worked on American farms and eaten American food and observed American abundance returned to a Germany that needed rebuilding more completely than almost any other country in the modern world. Many of them contributed to that rebuilding in the following decades. Some returned to America as immigrants, drawn back by the country they had experienced as prisoners. Some became advocates for the democratic institutions that the Allied occupation was attempting to establish. Men whose support for democracy was grounded not in abstract political theory, but in the lived experience of having been treated with dignity by a democratic country when their own country had nothing left to offer. The cake in Alabama. The butter he hadn't seen since before the war. The chocolate that was real chocolate, not substitute. These were not large things. They were not the stuff of strategic analysis or historical argument. But they were the things that Heinrich Brandt and Ernst Dietrich and Werner Schaeffer and Otto Klessmann wrote home about, with a mixture of guilt and astonishment and something approaching wonder, because they could not write about them without also writing about what those things meant for the war and for the country that was losing it. They had been sent to fight a nation their government had told them was decadent and weak and spiritually empty. They had arrived, instead, in a nation that was feeding its enemies cake. And somewhere in the gap between those two descriptions of the same country lay the truth about why the war ended the way it did. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. Your support helps us continue sharing important stories from the Second World War that deserve to be remembered. Subscribe to join our community of history enthusiasts from around the world. We would love to hear from you in the comments, whether you have family connections to this history or simply appreciate learning about the past. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping keep these stories alive for future generations.